The state expanded the voucher program in 2023, wiping out family income requirements, and voucher use has jumped 67% since then. Because schools are funded on a per pupil basis, declining enrollment means a drop in state money. Basically meaning that now that that the state is pushing charter schools, that money that would go to the district is now being funneled into charter schools. Remember how unpopular the whole Medicare for all who want it was that Pete Buttigieg proposed? It wasn't a single payer healthcare system, but it was what they call a public option. Well, they're doing the same thing, and they have been doing the same thing in regards to public education. There is a public option. So you can either do a charter school, or you can go to a regular public school. Well, since a lot of parents are now opting in for the charter school, well, that takes money away from the public schools, meaning that now who is going to be worse off? It's going to be the students that are still at public schools. You know, education is one of the benefits of living in a modern society, public education, I should say. But unfortunately, because of the way our system is set up, there's going to be many people who suffer because the system is set up to push for a more corporate-centered system versus one that's just a public good for the people. And as a product of Orange County Public Schools education, I feel like as this empire circles the drain, it's only going to get worse from here. So I want to get into this article, and this is going to be out of the Orlando Sentinel. Let's get into this. So this is out of the Orlando Sentinel. It says, Orange School District to lose 3,100 students, millions in funds next year. So, of course, we're going to go over this. It says Orange County Public Schools is expected to lose about 3,100 students and $27.8 million in state funding for the next school year, a loss that has prompted fears about teacher layoffs in crowded classrooms. In a recent memo to employees, OCPS said that their expected loss of state money will have major implications on one of the state's largest school districts and will mean all departments must reduce their operating budgets by 2%. Quote, we must be strategic and innovative in our approach to budgeting, prioritizing the initiatives that have the greatest impact on student outcomes. End quote. The projected drop in enrollment is the biggest since the 20 to 2021 school year, which saw a 10,000 student decline in the wake of the pandemic. That was from Scott Howat. It says the COVID era enrollment declines were offset by the arrival of the federal pandemic funding, but that money dries up this school year. Declining birth rates. Remember what I talked about those of us who are millennial and Gen Z, we ain't having kids because we can't afford them. Declining birth rates and the expansion of the state's voucher program, which provides state-funded scholarships to any interested student, are driving OCPS current enrollment drop. The state expanded the voucher program in 2023, wiping out family income requirements, and voucher use has jumped 67% since then. Because schools are funded on a per pupil basis, declining enrollment means a drop in state money. Basically meaning that now that that the state is pushing charter schools, that money that would go to the district is now being funneled into charter schools. Remember how unpopular the whole Medicare for all who want it was that Pete Buttigieg proposed? It wasn't a single payer healthcare system, but it was what they call a public option. Well, they're doing the same thing, and they have been doing the same thing in regards to public education. There is a public option. So you can either do a charter school or you can go to a regular public school. Well, since a lot of parents are now opting in for the charter school, well, that takes money away from the public schools, meaning that now who is going to be worse off? It's going to be the students that are still at public schools. And we'll get into the flaws within charter schools in a little bit. But this is something that a lot of people don't regard. But a lot of students are enrolling into charter schools. But at the same time, it also is going to cause a drop in enrollment at the public schools, which are funded on a per pupil basis. So it says, Howard said, Orange County was not alone in seeing enrollment loss, as 47 out of the 67 other Florida school districts are also projecting that they'll enroll fewer students next year. The district is pushing the state legislature to increase the per student allocation to help alleviate the funding shortfall. It says, and OCPS's goal is to keep teachers in classrooms. Howard said, our hope is that we can retain our teachers. We need as many teachers as we can get. Clinton McCracken, president of Orange County's Teachers Union, said that the statement that the school board had a responsibility to prevent staffing shortages in overcrowded classrooms that could come from a funding shortfall. It is critical that the district and school board prioritize protecting classrooms from cuts. Our students cannot afford larger class sizes or fewer staff. Now, Howard said that the district would send teachers additional information about possible school assignment changes once the state budget is finished, which he said could come out at the end of the week. Teachers might need to switch schools as the enrollment drops might be more severe at some campuses than others. So this is bad. This is bad. It says, before the district considers cutting institutional positions, it needs to look at what programs it can go without. People are the best choice for our students, teachers, high quality teachers. OCPS continues to lose students and then subsequently lose funding to school choice vouchers. Gallo said that the district needs to be more competitive. She said OCPS can look into district-run charter and micro schools, which could offer parents more choices. In order to stay competitive, we're going to have to be innovative. We are going to have to change how the public education works. If a proposed state law passes, OCPS could also lose $17 million from the state programs like advanced placement and international baccalaureate courses, which could cause some high school students to pay out of pocket for materials and exams. So ultimately what happens is if you still have a child that is still in public school, they're going to fare worse now because of these budgeting shortfalls. Because a lot of parents are now sending their kids to charter schools, unfortunately, your kid that's still in public school suffers. So a lot of these things that are necessarily in public schools get cut, which means that their education, the quality of their education goes down. So I want to share this video that goes over charter schools. And I think this is going to be one where it's once he gets into it, you guys are going to see the gist of why charter schools really is a disadvantage to students. So let's get into it.
There are a lot of myths out there about charter schools that I think this report helps dispel. And so for those that don't know, charter schools are publicly funded but privately owned schools. They emerge.
Okay, so first of all, publicly funded but privately owned, meaning they get their money from the government, but when it comes to actually running it, the government does not have that big of a say. You get where it's coming from now? All right, let's let the man continue.
Emerged in the 1990s and were sold as an innovative alternative to traditional public schools. At this time, there was a lot of talk about how the U.S. educational system was falling behind. And the idea was that if we could bring a market-based and competitive approach to education, we could see better results. Freed from regulation, charters could develop a unique curriculum and figure out what works best for the 21st century. And charters had been a relatively new phenomenon, and without a longer-term assortment of data, myths about the inherent superiority of charters have been allowed to persist unchecked. But now, almost 30 years into this experiment, we have more data and the results are not looking good. The Network for Public Education just published a report called Broken Promises, an analysis of charter school closures from 1999 to 2017. It is a comprehensive study that looked at all charter schools and how long they stayed open. After all, at the most basic level, one judge's success would be if a school can even keep its doors open. They also look at data from specific cities, especially those with high poverty, as these are the communities that charter schools claim to be helping the most. Let's start with New Orleans, which is somewhat of a unique sample. After Hurricane Katrina devastated the city, school privatizers saw an opportunity, and the entire city school system became privatized. This has only brought more instability, the report says. It says charter churn is baked into the New Orleans model. More than 35 charter schools in the city shut down between 2006, the year following Hurricane Katrina, and 2017. Surviving schools are frequently taken over by new operators who often have a very different mission and vision for the school. The days of stable schools rooted in New Orleans communities and governed by local elected school boards are gone. Charters appear and then they are gone. The promise of better opportunities for local children has become a promise broken over and over again.
So this is what happens when you try to privatize public education. A market-based approach to a public good. When you have the profit model introduced to even elementary, middle, and high school education, when you introduce a market-based approach, that means that some people are going to lose out. That means that some people are going to suffer. Because now you're erecting a wall, a paywall between yourself and your education, or yourself and the education of your students. And so even though it is publicly funded, it's privately ran. Meaning, guess what? There are now going to be ways to maximize as much of that public money to be profit so that they can have more for their shareholders, or they won't call them shareholders, but essentially they're shareholders. And so who suffers? The children suffer. So let's continue.
gets even worse at the national level. The report goes on. Between 1998 and 2015, more than 9,000 charter schools in the U.S. opened and enrolled students. However, more than 3,700 of those schools closed. Of the 606 charters that began serving students in 1999, only 256, or 42%, were still open in 2017. Now, some charter school advocates try to argue that this constant churn is actually a good thing. It's good when bad schools are forced to close. It helps innovation keep happening. But anyone, whether a student, parent, or teacher who has experienced a school closing, knows that it only causes disruption that is terrible for education, let alone social and emotional health. There are endless, heartbreaking stories of sudden charter school closures upending communities. Ashe Preparatory Academy in Seattle closed literally 1 month after opening, stranding 140 elementary school children. Conditions have become so bad that teachers just quit en masse and stopped coming to work. In Tennessee, Nashville's New Vision Academy charter school suddenly closed mid-year after safety violations, overcrowding, and financial issues. The school actually never had an occupancy permit, and 158 students had to scramble to find a new school. So many of you are probably wondering, how can so many charters be closing like this when it's so bad for children's education? And you're right to wonder this, but in some ways it's missing the point. This is what happens when you introduce the business model to education, which should be a public good. What does make sense or what doesn't make sense for education makes a lot of sense for the bottom line of profit.
That's what I have been saying. Because it's not the students that benefit. It is the people at the top. Because your student, your kid becomes the product. This is why a market-based approach doesn't work in public education, because public education is a public good. And yet some people will say, well, they're doing better with our kids. Are they? Because my question is, why don't we just take that funding and just fund public education better? And people say, well, you're just throwing money at the problem. You're throwing money at the problem by allowing these charter schools. That's throwing money at the problem. The only difference is that the money that you're throwing, it's not all going to the students. It's going to the people at the top.
Broken Promises report, I think, put it best when it said, success in the prevailing competitive model of education depends on many things, but first and foremost on filling enrollment goals. If founders are struggling to keep the school afloat, it is in their narrow self-interest to keep staff and families in the dark lest they leave the school, thus accelerating and ensuring its downfall. We now have 30 years of data on charter schools, and the numbers don't lie. They have not proven to be the shiny new savior of education that they claim to be. And while we know charters are privately owned, it can be hard to trace exactly how people profit from charter schools. Often they are classified as or mixed up with nonprofits, blurring the lines of their financial operations. Charter schools usually become registered as a nonprofit that gets funding from the state and then gives these funds to a for-profit company to manage the school and provide services. Recently, Jacobin interviewed Carol Burris from the Network for Public Education, who described how this process works, saying, the for-profit then either directly provides services, from management services to cafeteria services, or they contract out with another for-profit company to provide services. Either way, the goal is to run the charter school in such a way that there's money left over. And the more money they save by doing things like hiring unqualified teachers and refusing to teach students with special needs, the more money is left at the end of the day.
So the money that they would use per pupil is reduced. So it's actually faring worse for kids because they got to get theirs. Versus in a public school where it's considered a public good, they maximize the amount of money that goes to per student. You see why the profit model should not be in education? And I say this is why the profit model should also not be in higher education. This goes into things like tuition costs and like colleges and universities. Ooh, that's a good topic for discussion. Let's continue.
And this gets at another way the data of charter schools can be skewed in an unfair way. Public schools have a commitment to educate all children, including children with special needs. We cannot deny a child because they require extra resources or make our task in the classroom more challenging. Any teacher knows that having a classroom with multiple students with individualized educational needs can change the whole dynamic. But the profit making does not stop at the services the for-profit company provides. It also extends to real estate. And so Carol Burrows also explains, real estate is another way management companies often use to make profits. They get all kinds of tax advantages and low interest loans to buy a property, and then they lease the property at a big profit to their charter schools. Public money goes into the charter nonprofit and goes out to the for-profit real estate company, which owns the building. So essentially, you have the taxpayer paying the mortgage. And then after the mortgage is paid off, they'll sell it to the charter school at an inflated price. And what's worse, there's virtually no oversight over these financial operations, unlike with public schools. This is partly why when a charter suddenly closes due to fraud or mismanagement, it comes as a shock to the students and the public. In public schools, school districts are elected or at least appointed by an elected official like a mayor. If you don't like what they're doing, you can vote them out. The boards of nonprofits are privately appointed, and many charters have billionaires and their friends sitting on the board overseeing operations they make money off of. This complete lack of oversight leads to countless scandals of fraud and mismanagement. In San Diego, heads of the A3 charter school were found guilty of embezzling $210 million through their school. They also bought children's personal information to falsely enroll them in the schools and pocket the money that was provided for services for these non-existent students. In 2018, the owner of the Goodyear Charter School in Arizona was accused of fraud, which led to a sudden closure of the school. And let's take a look at that incident.
Standing behind their attorney, former teachers and staff of the now shuttered charter school are accusing the school's owner of using state funds to live a life of luxury.
There were things that were purchased on personal credit cards that school funds were used to pay off. The janitorial staff for the school used to clean his personal residence.
He's talking about this man, Daniel Hughes, seen here in a 2015 interview. Hughes sent out this email to parents and teachers last Monday stating financial woes had made it impossible to keep the school open despite already receiving more than $2 million from the state. Attorneys for the teachers say those problems were self-inflicted.
Well, the cooks from the school used to cater and sponsor parties at his house, his daughter's first birthday party. These aren't allegations. These are facts.
Now, to be fair, these kinds of examples are exceptionally bad, and there are many charters that operate without scandals. And of course, mismanagement can and does happen in public schools. But the sheer volume of instances involving charter schools, resulting from the clear lack of transparency and oversight, indicates that there is a big problem here. And I want to be clear, the enemy here is not parents that send their kids to charter schools or students or teachers. Many families send their kids to charters because they face a very difficult and practical choice. If their public school is chronically underfunded and doing terribly, it's hard to blame them for wanting to give charters a try. So we need to be careful not to target the wrong people. Also, we need to be able to talk about this with a degree of nuance. I used to substitute teach in charter schools in Philadelphia for a couple of years, which gave me a broad picture of a wide array of charter schools. Now, some of the charters I taught at were worse than average public schools. Many were around the same, and some were better than the average public schools. But for those that were better, it was clear why. They had a lot of resources, a lot of programs, small class sizes, a brand new building. They got public money plus private money, and these resources made a better outcome.
So he also brings up another good point. You can't blame parents for wanting a better education for their kids. And so what happens is these charter schools are dangled in front of parents, right? So here's what they do. It's It's the Finding Nemo aquarium effect. Anybody who watched the Disney movie Finding Nemo, there's a part in the movie where they want to get out. So what do? They have Nemo throw a rock into the turbine for the filter, and it stops the filter. It stops the water filtration system. And so then the water gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And so that means that aquarium essentially has to get cleaned out, and the water has to have to get rid of that dirty water. It's the same thing what they did with public education. What they'll do is called death by 1,000 cuts, as they will cut and cut and cut and cut public education to the point where the students start to suffer. And then they'll take that same money and go, hey, here's a charter school, right, that your kid can go to so that your kid can get a better education. Because look at these public schools, they're not doing good. But it's because they cut them so much that they can't do good. And so then you desperately want your kid to have a good education, so you send them to the charter school. And then the charter school gets that money, that public money that would have went to that public school, but now it's going to the charter school. And some people will go, well, the charter school is actually doing better. Well, yeah, because the charter school is actually getting the money, and they're getting better funding than per pupil than the public school. And then you also may have some private money that may come in to make it even better. And so then students are able to thrive in that school, not because it's charter, but because it's well funded. And it's the same thing. If you were to well fund public education, the same effects can happen there too. But the problem is that they cut and cut and cut and cut so that you'll go to the charter school, and then the charter school will end up making profit off of your kid, and they probably will give equal or worse education than they still would have gotten at a public school. And then who's running out the back door with the money? And so ultimately, it's about the notion to privatize. Because if you privatize something, that means that it's not available to everyone. It's not available to all students. It's available to some students. It's available to some students that are chosen by them. Charter schools can choose which students come into their classrooms, versus public schools take every single student that it enrolls. Because public education is seen as a public good, whereas charter schools, really, education is a privilege. I, for one, think that public education, really all education, is a public good, because it should not be gate kept away from certain undesirables. Let's continue.
The point is that it's not much of a secret of what makes schools good schools. They need robust funding and support to create quality conditions and programs. Of course, public schools that have been drastically underfunded for generations are not going to be doing well. We need to support our existing public schools properly. Then parents won't be forced to make a choice about whether to send their kids to a charter or not. Families in affluent communities with well-funded public schools don't need to make this choice, and that's what everyone deserves. While we should be understanding of why families choose charters and not target them, ultimately we have to follow the money and be clear about what the overall project of charter schools is and how they actively damage public schools. Remember, charters receive public funding that could and should be going to existent public schools. Let's listen to educators in California talk about how charter schools affect their school funding.
And what's happened with the proliferation of so many charter schools is that sometimes it just becomes a parallel school district, and it actually bleeds away money from the neighborhood schools.
When a student leaves to attend a charter school, the money we spend to educate them follows. But the student's old public school can't reduce its costs by that same amount. It can't spend less for AC or heat. Its principal can't work part-time. To make up the difference, the school has to cut arts and music classes, lay off its librarian or nurse, clean its bathrooms less, or pay teachers so little they need another job to support their families. A first-of-its-kind study of 3 California districts found that on average, charter schools are taking over $1,000 a year from the education of each neighborhood school student. Charter schools cost San Diego's district nearly $66 million during the 2016-17 school year alone. In a state where public schools already struggle for resources, allowing more charter schools is making things worse for many students and threatening the very meaning of public education itself.
Well, the value of public education is critical because it's the underpinnings of democracy. Because every single student that comes through our door, unlike charter schools, we accept. And we must serve and give them the best possible education. And there's a cost to serving any student that comes across our threshold.
We need to invest in our public schools, and not even just for education's sake. Public education has been central for creating and sustaining our democracy. Again, it is a commitment to invest in every child, no matter their class status or race or whatever is going on in their life. It's not a coincidence that public education came to the South as part of the wave of reforms that took place after the Civil War during Reconstruction, that brief period of time when African Americans could and did exercise their democratic rights before Jim Crow. And public schools were seen as crucial to the advancement of Black communities. Author Derek W. Black wrote eloquently about the connection between public education and our democracy, saying, "Over and over again, when America makes big leaps forward in guaranteeing the right to a public education, it's articulated as a necessary component of fulfilling the promise of democracy. This thread runs throughout American history. Each moment that democracy is expanded, such as with the first and second Reconstructions, public education has been massively expanded too. And each moment that democracy is contracted, such as with Jim Crow and the backlash to the Civil Rights Movement, the assault on public education has happened alongside that contraction." But I do think the tide is starting to turn, and more people are beginning to see it. As I said before, charters are no longer the shiny new kid on the block. We have a wide body of experience with them and are seeing the results. More organizations are turning a critical eye to them. A few years ago, the NAACP and the Movement for Black Lives came out and demanded a moratorium on new charter expansion, citing their role in increasing school segregation. Let's listen to NAACP official Hillary Schulten talk about it.
What we had during those times and thereafter were charter schools that were being put in place in many places to undercut many of the policies and protections civil rights has provided. Things like, for instance, making sure that teachers at least have a degree and are certified before they teach. That's a minimum standard. Many charter schools went around that and even hired teachers without degrees at all, creating all kinds of other problems. We had charter schools that were carpetbaggers. That is, they'd come in, and before they could figure out that the charter school was not providing the service, the charter school was gone. Now, look, you're right. There are some charter schools that have proven effective. But if you go back and talk to the assistant secretaries for civil rights in the Department of Education, the last two, you'll find all the suits that have been filed because charter schools are being utilized in places like Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina as tools to maintain segregation. So in essence, that's why we're calling for a moratorium. We've got to take a closer look at this. There's a big problem with how these schools are being utilized in so many areas.
There is a deep connection between what goes on in charter schools and what goes on in your neighborhood public school. As some viewers know, I've taught in Philly public schools for the last 5 years. I've talked about the terrible conditions most schools face: 80-year-old buildings with mold, lead, and asbestos, roofs caving in, classrooms of 40 students. And at the same time, we see brand new charter school buildings going up. Of course, those children deserve to have a good building, but we can do that for all public schools and not drain money away from some schools to give to others. The charter school movement is part of the overall neoliberal project to privatize more and more aspects of our lives that should be social. Education is about developing our capacities as human beings to the fullest. The profit motive does not have a role here. And as the data shows, for-profit education is not even succeeding by its own standards. So I'll end with a line from a public school teacher, Peter Green's blog in the Huffington Post, where he says, "Modern charters are not public schools, and they do not make a public school commitment to stay and do the work over the long haul. They are businesses, and they make a business person's commitment to stick around as long as it makes sense to do so. That does not make them evil, but it does make them something other than a public school. And it underlines another truth. Students are not their number one priority."
So ultimately, this is what's happening here in Orange County, is that the students are no longer the number one priority. And is, parents are really under duress, because now they're making the choice because they want their kid to actually have a good education. And now they're opting for a charter school instead of having them go through a regular public education, which, if it's well funded, can be just as good, right? Think about this. When I was in high school, we didn't have wood shop. We didn't have metal shop. There was no pool for swim classes. There's all these things that a lot of these schools, like the more affluent schools, they have way more resources. Like, for instance, I went to Oak Ridge High School, right, in my first 2 years. And then I went to a magnet high school for, to learn a trade. But Oak Ridge High School had way less resources than, say, a Dr. Phillips High School. Dr. Phillips High School actually was in a more affluent area. Yes, it was a public school, but because schools are funded by property tax, then they actually receive better funding. And so it goes to show that, the education, when a school is well funded, it actually creates better results. But the problem is that, well, the cappies, they want to get their grubby little hands on the education so that they can make more money off of our kids. At the end of the day, public education really is a public good, and it should be treated as such. And this is why I am against charter schools myself. But at the same time, I'm not going to blame parents for sending their kids to a charter school, because that's more of a individualistic blame game. I blame the system for allowing charter schools to exist in the first place. And it's basically creating a two-tiered education system among our kids. Just like, the public option versus single-payer healthcare created a two-tiered healthcare system. Same thing with charter schools and public schools. I don't want there to be two tiers. Everybody should have a level playing field when it comes to their education. And also, a lot of charter schools, they will deny kids, especially those who are special needs, they'll deny them as well. And that's not fair at all. Special needs being kids that may have disabilities, whether they be intellectual disabilities, neurodivergence, or they have physical disabilities. And that's also not fair. Because if it's a public good, it should be treated as a public good. Because if you're not willing to serve all the people, that means you're willing to let some of the people fall by the wayside. And it's just not the way we should center society. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.